This is the Mountaineer Moment, your source for all things West Virginia football and basketball. From pregame to postgame coverage and breaking news, we've got you covered. Let's go. Welcome back to Mountaineer Moment, a podcast covering West Virginia football and basketball. And after that thrilling backyard brawl win in overtime for the Mountaineers, it is officially time to turn the page to Big 12 conference play. The Mountaineers will be opening things up in the Big 12 conference on the road in Lawrence, Kansas for a matchup with the Jayhawks. And so we'll have a few different episodes this week with the countdown to kickoff being on, and Saturday night for the Mountaineers on FS1 against the Jayhawks. So this episode is just going to be specifically about Kansas and who they are, what they bring to the table, what the Mountaineers should be looking for. We're calling this the Kansas Jayhawks Scouting Report episode, and so we'll talk a little bit about what Kansas has done so far this season, a little bit about their history over the last couple years, what they bring back, some new faces that are here, and schematically what they've looked like so far this season on offense and defense, and so what we can expect for this matchup coming up in just a matter of days. Mountaineers looking to kick off Big 12 play with a win on the road in the conference matchup with Kansas. Kansas is like a 11, 12, 13-point favorite in this one. You can bet that the Mountaineers are going to be using that for some extra motivation. Rich Rod was on the Pat McAfee show, and Pat McAfee's like, they're a two-touchdown favorite. And Rich Rod just said, yep, they are, and we'll be ready. So we'll see what kind of product the Mountaineers put out on to the field for this matchup with the Kansas Jayhawks. Again, this is Mountaineer Moment. My name's Troy, and this is our 23rd episode for a podcast that's been around for like 23 days, so we're pumping out episodes. Really cool. Just incredibly thrilled with the feedback and the response that this young show has gotten so far on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. So welcome aboard, and we would love for you to subscribe so you can be in the know when we have new content coming your way. So Kansas Jayhawks come into Big 12 play like the Mountaineers with a 2-1 record in the non-conference, and they actually were one of those teams that played in week 0, if you can call it that, with a win over Fresno State at home by a final score of 31-7 way back on August 23rd. So it'll be about a month since their first game when the Mountaineers do battle with them upcoming on the 20th of September. But Kansas took down the Bulldogs of Fresno pretty easily, 31-7. Jalen Daniels, the quarterback for Kansas, went 18 for 20 with 3 touchdown passes in that one. So he had himself a day. If that name sounds familiar, Jalen Daniels, it's because he's been at Kansas for about the last 17 years, it feels like. His career started there in 2020, and he has been a Jayhawk for a number of years now. Pretty crazy. I like to say that he's kind of like the Perry Ellis, what Perry Ellis was to Kansas basketball for so many years. I feel like he was there for a decade. That's Jalen Daniels to the Kansas football program. So Jalen Daniels is still the quarterback at Kansas somehow, believe it or not. Yep, he will be the starting quarterback against the Mountaineers coming up on Saturday. And then, so that was week 0. Kansas started the season 1-0, and then they played Wagner and took care of business there, 46-7. Their offense rolled in this one. They had 631 total yards. Their defense just allowed 143 to Wagner, so just dominant on both sides of the ball, as you might expect against that kind of opponent. Wide receiver Emmanuel Henderson had 6 catches for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their defense, again, gave up just 143 yards, but they had 3 sacks and 9 TFLs, which is something we're going to highlight over the course of this week when it comes to the Kansas Jayhawks, liking to get to the quarterback, liking to disrupt things in the backfield, get some TFLs, and so that's their story there. Then in week 2, for their third game, they played a rivalry game against Missouri. jumped out to a 21-6 lead over the Missouri Tigers, and then ended up losing this one on the road against Missouri, 42-31. Tigers offense just proved to be a little too much for Kansas to be able to handle. Missouri had 595 total yards compared to just 254 for the Jayhawks, who really, the story in this one, and something we're going to highlight, because again, Missouri, the SEC, Power 4 opponent, the only one that Kansas has played so far. Kansas could not get the running game going, just 31 yards on 19 carries, whereas they were a little more productive in those first couple of games on the season. But a 42-31 loss to Missouri, and then they had a bye week. So the Mountaineers played, that hard-fought game against Pitt, backyard brawl, overtime, just draining physically, emotionally, like everything. And Kansas was getting to sit at home. So we'll see if that plays a factor in this one, as Kansas has not played since that game against Missouri back on September the 6th. And so we'll see again what kind of factor that plays. But now what we're going to do is just kind of take a deeper dive. I mean, that's who Kansas is and what they've done, box score-wise through the first 3 games. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into who this Jayhawks offense is, who their defense is, and what we can expect coming up on Saturday. Okay, so again, offensive side of the ball, you got Jalen Daniels leading the way at quarterback, been there forever, and has really been a part of, Kansas turning this thing around, in some ways, right? They're not a they're not a top program or anything like that by any means, not, competing even, for college football playoffs or anything like that of, the recent years. But let's not forget how bad this Kansas football program was for well over a decade, and not long ago. And so Jalen Daniels, quarterback, has been a part of this turnaround of the last several years. And, they've had a good, couple of good, really good football teams. They've been ranked, a few times. More recently than West Virginia's been ranked in the AP poll. Thank you, Neil Brown. But anyway, Jalen Daniels leading the way at quarterback. Veteran presence, obviously. Running back Daniel Hillshaw is also a guy that began his career at Kansas back in 2020. He spent much of his career at running back backing up Devin Neal, who is, incredible career at Kansas and now is with the New Orleans Saints. Devin Neal onward to the NFL, but Daniel Hillshaw is back and in that spot at running back. As far as Kansas and their offense and what they have on the perimeter, I looked into this one. This is probably the deepest dive, you could say that, through the Kansas offense in my research there. This is an offense on the perimeter, wide receivers, targets, tight ends, and running backs that looks totally different from what it has in seasons past. So you got the familiarity with Daniels, but I double-checked this, but Kansas's top nine pass catchers from a season ago are not on the team in 2025. All right, so whether that be receivers or tight ends or running backs, Kansas lost nearly all of its production as far as receivers are concerned. Their leading receiver that is back happens to be the guy we just talked about, Daniel Hillshaw, who had just 33 yards receiving. So that's it. Top 9 pass catchers, some, obviously a couple, I think, on to the NFL, or, at least getting their shot on practice squads and what have you. And then 1 or 2 transfers maybe. And Devin Neal obviously was part of that, top 9 guys to, lead the way receiving for Kansas. Obviously, again, on to the New Orleans Saints. But again, what did they do? Like the Mountaineers have done. Obviously, they didn't. They don't have. Kansas doesn't have 81 new players on the roster like the Mountaineers. But receiver is one position they had to fill in a hurry because of that situation with guys out of eligibility or transferring or moving onward. Kansas went to the transfer portal. One of those guys, Emmanuel Henderson, we talked about with the great game against Wagner, as a transfer from Alabama who saw limited action in his 3 games. There, but as a Jayhawk, he's had that huge game, and he's got 183 yards total through 3 games, 12 catches and 2 touchdowns, both of which coming in that matchup with Wagner. They also brought in a guy named Cam Pickett, who had over 500 yards at Ball State and 2 touchdowns so far through 3 games, 10 catches and 124 yards and 3 TDs. And then lastly, a senior transfer from Albany of the FCS, Levi Wentz, had over 600 yards last year and has 7 catches and 103 yards so far for the Jayhawks. And so, again, lots of need for Kansas to replenish and figure out what they can do to, find some guys that can have an impact on the perimeter at wide receiver. And so they went out and got some guys, and 2-1 record coming in, and they did put up 31 points against Missouri, but obviously 21 of those were coming in the first quarter before Missouri kind of figured things out, and less than 300 yards of total offense in that previous matchup, and just unable to run the football. So something to keep an eye on there. Kansas offensive line, made up of a combination of players, right? They're kind of all over the place, just like I'm sure many teams are across the country, of guys who played and started last season at KU. Some other guys along this offensive line that were at KU and saw less action, and then some guys that obviously transferred in. But that point of Kansas being just unable to run the ball against Missouri is obviously going to lend to it being a key thing for Mountaineer fans to keep an eye on, because Mountaineers have done a pretty good job of stopping the run through their first 3 games, even against Pitt. And so that's a key matchup to watch, against West Virginia's front 7. How will Kansas look to run the football? Jalen Daniels, he I think has less than 100 yards through 3 games. And, he's a guy who, and I'll double check that, he's a guy who, last year had, let's see. Last year he had almost 500 yards, 447 yards, and 6 touchdowns on the ground. And this year just 90 yards on the ground. And so he hasn't gotten it going yet with his legs, but he's obviously more than capable. Back in 2022, he had over 400 yards and 7 touchdowns. So a guy, he's dealt with some injuries and other things throughout his time at Kansas, obviously with him being there for 6 years, right? But a guy that can run, and so look for him to maybe try and get involved in the rushing attack of Kansas. But that's a matchup to watch. Will Kansas be able to run it, or is West Virginia going to continue to be able to stop the run? And obviously that lends, okay, if Kansas isn't being able to run the football, then they're going to have to pass. And then again, we know who they're throwing to out on the perimeter. It's a bunch of new faces, transfers in from smaller programs, or again, the one who transfers in from Alabama didn't play much there. Then you got, Hillshaw out of the backfield and his opportunities to catch the ball. So keep an eye on that. As far as the Kansas offense, that's our scouting report there. Moving on to the defensive side of things. Kansas lost several key contributors on defense, especially in their secondary. Much like their wide receiver room, they had to add, via the transfer portal, especially in that position group in the secondary with corners and safeties. And their transfer linebacker, you might know this name, Trey Lathan, is currently Kansas's leading tackler through 3 games. Trey Lathan was, former Mountaineer who transferred to Kansas, and so. I don't mind that at all. I'm happy for Trey to be doing what he's doing at Kansas, leading the team in tackles through, just the first 3 games of the season. Kansas does rank 3rd. I mentioned this a moment ago. As far as with TFLs and sacks, they rank 3rd in the Big 12 with 10 sacks. For comparison, West Virginia is currently leading the conference and toward the tops in the nation with 12 sacks. Chattanooga transfer Leroy Harris is a key player to keep an eye on. He had 3.5 sacks, or has 3.5 sacks through their first 3 games. Defense obviously performed very, very well in the first 2 games against Fresno State and Wagner, but a lot of issues, a lot of things were exploited in that matchup with Missouri. Missouri's quarterback converted 30 of 39 pass attempts, 334 yards, and 3 touchdowns. 2 of Missouri's running backs went for over 100 yards. Team total of 47 carries, 267 for an average of 5.6 yards per carry. So Missouri offensively, after a slow start where Kansas, came out the gates rolling on the road, they figured things out offensively, they figured things out defensively, and really took that game and dominated, right? Yards per carry dominated, passing yards dominated. We can look at some of the other numbers here, but Missouri, again, after a slow start, they handled things pretty easily. Again, 595 yards to 254 total yards for Kansas. It's 261 rushing yards to just 31. They were over 50% on third down compared to Kansas being 3 for 11 on third down. They had 28 first downs compared to Kansas's 13 first downs. So Missouri came and defended home field in this rivalry game and took care of business. So I think what that leads us to discuss, and a further point, this is more focused on Kansas, obviously, in this episode, but further throughout the week, a matchup to talk about is West Virginia and Ty Edwards and his breakout game against Pitt, and now he's that guy in the backfield for the Mountaineers, and what's he going to do against this Kansas defense? Again, Missouri just had 2 guys go for over 100. Well, Ty Edwards just went for 140 and 3 touchdowns against Pitt. Massive performance from him, and until Kansas proves that they can stop the run, you can bet that Ty Edwards is going to be getting some carries. Right, he's averaging 5.6 yards a carry, and that's exactly what Missouri got in that matchup with Kansas just a couple weeks ago. So keep an eye on that matchup. But this is again just a preview into who Kansas is, what they got returning. They certainly have a lot of returning pieces, but they're having to fill in some gaps, especially along the perimeter with their corners and safeties and wide receivers. And Devin Neal he's hard to replace, even though they return, what's his name? Yeah, Daniel Hillshaw. Devin Hillshaw. Daniel Hillshaw. Even they return him. Devin Neal's a tough guy to replace. He's on the New Orleans Saints for a reason. He's super talented. Jalen Daniels is back, right? That brings some familiarity in that regard, but we'll just have to see what happens on game day. We're just gonna have to see how this thing shakes out. But after doing a deep dive myself into the likes of who this team has and how they performed so far this season, this is a winnable game for the Mountaineers. Again, the Big 12 rather wide open, and I'm not making any predictions down toward the end of the season. West Virginia going to do this or that, but you can go in and beat Kansas, absolutely. So let's go and do that. But this is a scouting report on Kansas. More episodes coming. Next one will be over or under with just a few kind of fun things, few numbers to look at and watch for in this matchup that the Mountaineers have coming up with Kansas. So be on the lookout for that. And then more extensive game previews and all that coming the rest of the week as we count down to kickoff on Saturday to open up Big 12 play in Lawrence, Kansas, a matchup between the Mountaineers and the Jayhawks. We will see you next time on Mountaineer Moment.